Thank you all for coming out. If it had rained, would you be here? Please, yes. It's snowing in Washington. So I had to rub it into all my friends I came to Wisconsin to get away from the snow. That never happens. I am thrilled to be here. Thank you all very much. I've had a delightful lunch. We've solved all the problems of the world, so I could just sit down now. But I thought I'd share a little bit of it with you and then stop and take your questions, because that's the part I most look forward to. I bring you greetings from Washington. Yeah, I know. And I come to take a break from a place where we have the same arguments over and over again. I'm really looking forward to your questions, because it occurs to me, we were talking about this at lunch, that we have those same arguments in our little bubble, and it's not till I come out of Washington that I discover what they really mean, and what better place to come to figure it out. But let me anticipate a few of your questions first. You will want to know if Washington is as screwed up as it looks. And the answer is no, because nothing could be as screwed up as it looks. More on that in a moment. You will want to know if journalism is hopelessly out of whack. And the short answer is not quite. In fact, we are a lot less screwed up than we look, as quietly as it's kept. More on that as well in a moment. And you will want to know, and this is the big one, if Jim Lehrer is as cool as he seems. The short answer is he is cooler and even more handsome. And I'll tell him you laughed. And you will want to know whether I liked it when Queen Latifah played me on Saturday Night Live. And the short answer is, of course I did, and you would too. But let's get down to business. We're at an interesting crossroads right now in our nation. We're at a place where unemployment is at 9.1%. It's just under 8% here in Wisconsin, but still, people are feeling very unhappy about it. And unlike in a lot of states, the jobless rate is directly tied to some of the interesting debates that you've been having. But even though there is that pressure, the Senate voted down the president's jobs plan. The nation's skyrocketing debt and deficit have been identified by everyone as major problems. But in spite of that, no one wants to cut entitlements or military spending. Everybody's got an ox they don't want gored. And that's just the economic debate. Don't get me started on immigration and education and health care. With every step forward, where apparent step forward comes a step back. But consider this. If you are a political junkie like me, if you believe that the wheels of government can actually turn, if you think that full-throated and spirited debate is what the founding fathers had in mind when they wrote the Constitution. They certainly didn't have me in mind, so they had to have something in mind. And if you believe in public service as well, then this is the time to start paying attention. We get fresh evidence of this every day, not only in Washington, but also around the world. Who among us have not been amazed at what we've seen unfolding in Egypt and Yemen and Bahrain and Tunisia and Libya? It's as if everyone everywhere is suddenly reconsidering government. We've watched in astonishment as lawmakers fled Frederica. That's where they were running away from. You know it's true. They fled the Wisconsin state capitol. They fled the Indiana state capitol rather than be backed into what they saw was a corner on what legislation they considered to be anti-union. And now the same fight is going on in Ohio, where I was a couple of weeks ago, where they're trying to repeal the law that they passed. I bet Governor Walker and Governor Kasich talk a lot. These are all wildly different conflicts from one another, from what we've seen unfolding in the Middle East and Northern Africa. But at the root of it all are individuals and governments who have basically decided that compromise is for chumps. I'm not sure that's a good idea in the end, but at least it guarantees somewhere along the line real debate. There are winners and there are losers, but there is precious little middle ground. There was a recent edition of the National Journal magazine which captured the Washington part of this kind of fractured equation quite neatly. The title of the story was "Pulled Apart." It's what we long suspected, that partisanship and hyperpolarization have reached epic levels in today's Washington, and that the middle has simply disappeared. National Journal has been ranking members of Congress on a scale of liberal to conservative for every year since 1982. This time on the scale, the polar opposites in the Senate were Arizona's Senator John McCain and 7 others on the right, and Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid and 8 others on the left. Now, you think, where was the middle? In the moderate category, the moderate members of Congress remain well apart, even the moderates, on this ideological divide. There was no Republican senator, including well-known moderates like Senators Olympia Snowe and Susan Collins from Maine, and Ohio's George Voinovich, who's since retired, that none of them was as liberal as the chamber's most conservative Democrat, who's Ben Nelson from Nebraska. In the House, there was a little more ideological overlap, but not by much. After the 2010 midterm elections, only one Republican, a guy named Walter Jones from North Carolina, compiled a voting record that could be considered moderate. As the ongoing standoff over budget cuts demonstrates, there appears to be little reward or incentive to even get to the middle anymore. Republican House Speaker John Boehner provided the most unintentionally illuminating window into this new reality, I thought, when he told Leslie Stahl repeatedly on 60 Minutes that he would not use the word compromise. He told her, quote, "When you say the word compromise, a lot of Americans look up and go, uh-oh, they're going to sell me out. And so finding common ground," he said, "I think, makes more sense." Wouldn't even use the word. Political scientists are seeing us pull apart, more momentum toward going apart than coming together. Now, accompanying this National Journal article I talked about was this photograph I found arresting. It was from 1988, and in it, then Senate Majority Leader Robert Byrd was sitting next to then Senate Minority Leader Robert Dole. Actually, it was, yeah, that's majority minority. I keep remembering who was what when. One was Republican, one Democrat. They're seated holding telephone receivers to the air, and it was after some Senate ratification vote, and they were calling President Reagan at the time to tell him about the successful vote. They were surrounded in the photograph by 8 other senators, half Democrats, half Republicans, all of them grinning and happy and compromised. Now, for the life of me, I can't imagine such a picture today, or even such a meeting taking place today. We watch the push and the pull between the parties in Congress and with the White House and in state governments from coast to coast, and we see truth as well as consequences over budgets, spending, but at its root, over our national priorities. But before you sneer about government gridlock and think about it, what clearer sense have we ever had of what it means to have checks and balances, that thing we say we want, than right now? And it's not all just politics. There is some real policy and philosophy involved here. Conservatives do think that raising taxes hurts job creation. Liberals do think that raising money from those who earn the most penalizes those who need it most. You can see with that vast difference why nothing seems to move. Now, all of this makes for a full employment economy for journalists, at least for those of us who are still working in journalism. I travel quite a bit. I often get to talk to people and try to get the pulse of Americans on the stories that should demand my attention and their attention as well. And everywhere I go, I try to offer a bit of a rough translation to what's going on in Washington and why everything seems so stuck, and why that might not always be a bad thing. Sometimes when things are stuck, it stops bad things from happening as much as good things. One thing I've noticed is we have been talking, however, past each other to an alarming degree, more than I've ever witnessed. One example comes to mind. Not long ago, I was in downtown Washington. I was on my way to a meeting at the Environmental Protection Agency. In fact, I was going to interview on stage for employees there the current EPA administrator, Lisa Jackson, and the agency's first administrator, William Ruckelshaus, and who was appointed and reappointed by Republican presidents Nixon and Reagan. Inside the building, we had this really calm, enlightening conversation about the things that these two people, one of them a 48-year-old Democrat, one of them a 77-year-old Republican, the things they had in common. They talked about climate change and conservation and all of those hot buttons that get everybody worked up and get the environmental movement so hot on the collar. But they, turns out, agreed on many things. While this was going on, across the street from where we were is an outdoor plaza in downtown Washington called Freedom Plaza. And as I walked by after I left, I noticed that hundreds of protesters had gathered, and they were singing and shouting and chanting, and I paused to see what was going on. I looked at my watch and realized it was April 15th, and this was tax day, and I was at my very first tea party. It was very exciting. But at the same time, I was struck by the extreme civility that was happening inside and the raucous unhappiness that was playing out outside, especially when Mr. Ruckelshaus offered his definition of freedom, which I thought was so interesting that I had to write it down. He said, "Freedom is not the absence of restraint, it is a system of restraint." Now, in which of these two locations was restraint being practiced? At that same spot in Washington today, Freedom Plaza, it's just blocks from the White House. It is now home to Occupy Washington. It's an encampment, of course. You have one here. They're all an offshoot of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And for all the world, it looks like the Tea Party did in its early days, kind of raucous and disorganized and loud and leaderless. Now, the Tea Party folks didn't camp out overnight in tents, and they were more likely to wear tri-corner hats when they went to their rallies. But other than that, it occurred to me that street protest had been reborn. Now, it remains to be seen if Occupy becomes the kind of political movement that the Tea Party became, but I wouldn't be surprised, because what happens with these movements is people who watch from the sidelines eventually run to the front of the line and claim to be leading the parade. I won't name any names. Now, all of this is news to me. Events that tell us things about our nation, about our beliefs, and about our priorities. But understand that I have some pretty specific definitions in mind when I talk about news. It's actually one of my it's one of my many pet peeves. All news is information, but not all information is news. This is an especially important notion in a world where people think the most important thing that happened that day is whatever they happen to see on their phone when they open their browser. In that world, Charlie Sheen's troubled life can be equated with a nuclear non-proliferation agreement. To them, it's all the same thing. In that world, anyone who sits in front of a camera and appears to be reading a teleprompter, maybe wearing a suit, can be considered a journalist. I go to college campuses all the time where students tell me, "Oh, I get all my information from Jon Stewart." And I have to remind them that Jon Stewart gets his information from me. And I'm not lying, he actually does. Not all of it, but he watches. And even he does not say that he is a journalist. He knows he is a comedian. It's important that we know it too. But I despair that we start in our curiosity when we have it and we end at Wikipedia or at the home page, at a time when it is more essential than ever that we dig deeper and ask harder questions and press for direct answers. Now, no doubt, people in my industry are also part of the problem. On one hand, many, if not most journalists, certainly the ones I know, are still doing amazing work and winning awards for it. Reporters in Baghdad and Pakistan and Afghanistan are literally risking life and limb to tell us stories. Analysts in Washington and New York and Madison are asking the unanswerable questions every day, and they don't give up simply because their questions are not answered. The Virginia newspaper that won a Pulitzer Prize a couple of years ago for public service employed exactly 7 reporters. So it's not all about resources either. They were just doing the work. But there is often so much chatter and noise and sensation that the best of what we do is often obscured. This extends to the correspondence I receive online, on Twitter, and occasionally, shockingly, even in the United States mail. Many of those of us who do bother to write are angry, often because what I try to do, and what I'm paid to do is actually tell both sides of a story. On one occasion, we did a PBS NewsHour Spotlight series where we travel to different cities and focus on what people are talking about there, and we were in Tampa, Florida. And one of the things I learned in that trip to Florida, once again, why I like to get out of Washington, is why Americans are spending so much time fighting each other. Part of it is a lack of information, I mentioned, but a lot of us are simply not listening. Case in point, we interviewed an 81-year-old retiree who was just upset about the health care law. She was part of a panel that also included a physician, a part-time caregiver who favored it, and a small businessman who opposed it. The woman who identified herself as a member of the Tea Party was opposed as well. And man, did the viewers hate that. They got all worked up. They wrote, one viewer wrote, "What the hell kind of reporting is gathering a quartet of regular people around a table to spout their opinions about health care? The problem is, that's exactly what I'm paid to do, to hear what people have to say and to offer a balance." The woman in Tampa felt that the health care bill went too far, that it was going to reduce her Medicare coverage and her access to care. Senior citizens, she worried, would be denied life-prolonging devices like pacemakers, and there would be a committee of government officials addicted to actuarial longevity tables. She worried about this. This is where the death panel discussions came from. Now, it should be said that much of what she said was actually not accurate, and that was reflected as well in our discussion. One of the other guests at the table said, hey, the Medicare benefits that are guaranteed. Those aren't going to change. And so I think it sort of evens the playing field so that Medicare is going to last longer for all of us and be there for all of us. But that wasn't enough for all of my angry emailers who only seemed to hear what they disagreed with. Another viewer wrote, "Giving equal weight and respect to knowledgeable and ignorant alike isn't the kind of reporting for which I watch the NewsHour." Yes, we get a lot of mail like that, telling us what we should do. But this runs counter to how I see my moderator's role. Our job as journalists is to provide the best information we can and then do our best to let you make up your own mind. We don't take sides. But then there is a vigorous debate. When there is a vigorous debate going on, we can't simply ignore it. We have a responsibility to listen. In Florida, in Wisconsin, throughout the nation, the discussion about the merits of that new health care law are still going on. And the opinion split is real. In fact, the Supreme Court, I believe if not this week, then maybe next week, November 10th, is scheduled to decide whether they're going to take up that law and weigh in on its constitutionality. They probably will. You can't cover the news and look the other way, no matter how personally you feel one way or the other. Now, hopefully you'll never know what I think personally about anything. Except maybe, well, no, not even that. Because it's not for me to tell you what to think or for you to even infer what I think. I'm hoping that you never know. Now, a lot of our fractious disagreement is rooted in our politics. Democrats are more likely, for instance, to approve of President Obama's job performance, as Republicans are to disapprove. I vote for hearing everybody out. We're about to see all of it play out in real time. Because for me, elections are when the rubber hits the road. Questions: can Mitt Romney hold on to his porous but consistent lead in the polls, even if that lead can't get above 25% right at this moment? Or will Republican primary voters keep falling in love with alternatives? First Michelle Bachmann, then Rick Perry, and now Herman Cain. Will the president be able to survive his own declining approval numbers? Or will he be reelected simply because the other party has to nominate somebody who will beat him? Closer to home, will cities and counties and states come to grips with their own dire fiscal circumstances by laying off more government workers? Will local businesses ever hire again to fill any of that gap? And will all of this conspire to stunt any effort at a recovery that makes housing affordable again and keeps taxes low and allows us to send our children to college? These are the issues that are going to be front and center in an election year that I already find fascinating. I've covered, as you heard, 6 presidential elections, and the biggest change for me this time is one: it's technology. Candidates can rise and fall on the strength of a tweet, and have. And Anthony Weiner, that's all I'm saying. One outrageous moment of incivility, calling the president a liar from the floor of the House of Representatives, or booing a gay soldier at a candidates debate, that can resonate for weeks. And the internet moves so fast that conclusions are often reached well before the facts can catch up to them. And everyone seems to have, in the end, their minds already made up, seeking out only the websites or the news cable channels that suit their predetermined opinion. As a result, conservatives often think reporters are a bunch of liberals in love with President Obama and everything he stands for. Meanwhile, liberals think we're a bunch of sellouts devoting way too much time to the likes of Sarah Palin and the Tea Party. Neither thing is true, and much of this betrays a deeply rooted skepticism about the role of the press. It doesn't have to be this way. There's so much out here to know that no one has an excuse, aside from sheer laziness or inattention, to be underinformed. More than ever, if you don't know, it's now reached the point where it's your fault and not ours. But we do have a responsibility. And more than 30 years in journalism have taught me the difference between how to be skeptical and how to be cynical, and how to recognize it when it's a virtue to have a little bit of skepticism and a little bit of cynicism. I should say I come down on the side of skepticism, because my thinking is if I'm cynical, I've already answered the question. I've decided, I've made up my mind, I don't want to hear anymore. If I'm skeptical, I always have more questions. I always think there's a possibility of a new answer. My mind, therefore, stays open. That's what journalists need to be. It's taught me that the best lessons are not necessarily learned from the people with the most power and the loftiest title, but just by sometimes keeping your ears open and writing down what you hear. In 2004, I remember walking into a Piggly Wiggly in Ohio, into a county that we'd carefully selected because it swings both ways every election. One year it's Democrat, one year it's Republican. And I was walking through this grocery store and I came across a middle-aged fellow wearing a bomber jacket with Steelworkers Union logo on it. And when I approached him, he said, oh yeah, I just got laid off, but I laid off 11 months ago from the steel plant in town. So I, in my mind, immediately leaped ahead that he would be a Kerry voter. Here he was, a union guy, here he was suffering from the bad economy, and he certainly wasn't going to vote to re-elect George W. Bush. Instead, he told me, oh yeah, I'm voting for Bush, which made me stop and pause and ask him why. And he said, I like the guy. Now, I put that away in my hip pocket, and a month later when the election happened and George W. Bush won narrowly over John Kerry, I realized one of the key reasons was because many people liked the guy and they didn't like Kerry that much, not enough. If he was losing voters like this union guy, this laid off union steelworker in central Ohio, then who else wasn't he losing? I didn't realize at the time that by keeping my ears open and writing it all down, I was getting a key to the outcome of the election. But in spite of all that, people like to ask me all the time whether I think that journalism is going to hell in a handbasket because there's so many other ways to cover the news. And I say no, it's not all opinion, not all infotainment. Why not have cable shows where people shout at each other? That's okay by me. Why not have Entertainment Tonight? That's okay by me. Why not have C-SPAN too? That's okay by me. Why not the nightly news? The more, the merrier. What that means, though, is that the viewer, the reader, the educator, we all have to take greater responsibility for our own news consumption and getting the information that we need. And the news consumer has to learn to assign relative value to the information that you're receiving. But in exchange for our First Amendment protections, we too must be held accountable. That's the deal we make to get to do the jobs we do. Being in the middle of it all when the story gets interesting, when it really matters, isn't just prurient, when we don't have to explain why it ought to matter, that's why I do what I do. For those of us who love politics and actually kind of like politicians, I kind of do, I know, it's a failing. But I also like them because I respect government and because the vast majority of the politicians I've ever met are in it for the right reasons. And if you care about these things, there's always another great story around the corner that actually affects people's lives. War, peace, freedom, conflict, disaster, recovery. They're all stories worth telling. The challenge is laid out right in front of us, and that's where you come in. And that's why if you're here and you are engaged in a civics exercise by even being at this luncheon today, you know your responsibility. You have to listen. You have to question. You have to participate, and sometimes you even have to yell a little. On Washington Week and the PBS NewsHour, we don't yell so much. But we do approach the news with a fairly simple premise. We assume that that you can decide what to think if we give you that information to think with. We're not to be confused with cable. We hope you never know what we think or that we ever reach any personal conclusions. But we believe that you are hungry to know. that the rigors of daily life, no matter what they are, the challenges, don't entirely obliterate the need for you to know what's going on beyond the end of your nose, beyond your neighborhoods. We believe that you want to know more. But as the news seems to get more urgent and international challenges increase, the questions also get harder to answer. Politicians have figured that out. Most of the people I've met get into politics for noble reasons. They want to represent people, or they want a bully pulpit, or they want to somehow take advantage of the promises that are given to us in the Constitution. And they realize something I came to realize early in my career, that everything is politics. Politics determines whether our children go to school or not, what sort of education they receive, whether they go to war when they grow up, or whether they go to graduate school, whether they go to the Peace Corps, or whether they go to Wall Street. We are political junkies in, I think, the broadest and most uplifting sense of the term. We're in love with the idea that unknowns and underdogs can get elected against the odds because we are convinced that it matters. But in this new age of instant information, our eyes have to be open wider, our questions have to be persistent, and they become more essential. So you're not going to hear any press bashing from me. That's too easy. It's more informative to understand what we do, how we do it, and why. Because I think we're living through a transformational time. 9/11 transformed us. It shifted our priorities and our expectations of government. So too did the 2008 election year. No matter what the outcome was, we became invested in it. The results of the 2010 midterm elections were like that too. They revealed yet more evidence of investment. And 2012, I predict, will be another year like that. And investment is exactly what we need, whether the plan is to change the world at large or just to cope with the world around us. We can celebrate the time that we live in or despair that we are on the wrong path. I choose to celebrate. I wrote a book a couple of years ago about candidates who break through and make history. The folks I wrote about are smart, motivated, energetic, engaged. They figured out that going along to get along is not the formula for success. Leaders who figured out that someone would always tell them no, that someone would always say they weren't something enough, and that the goals that seemed out of reach were worth reaching for anyway. That is no one else's fault. It is our responsibility. But beware of the idea of a magic wand, that we will get where we want to go without effort. That's never going to happen. I got into journalism in part to kind of try to make that effort, because I thought on some level that I could change the world, that I could break through, that I could shed a little light in a few dark corners, that I could break down a few barriers. And now, thanks to the information technology explosion, you get to do some of that too. The questions do get tougher to ask, and the answers get harder to take, but we and you have to keep asking, pushing for the change that we seek. Sometimes change does seem to happen overnight. We blink, we look up, and there's something different than we had ever seen before. But mostly, it happens over time, and it seldom happens in an orderly manner. I'll leave you with this, and then I'll be happy to take your questions. I'm not done yet. One more story. Unless you're applauding because I'm done. I don't know. When I was growing up, one of my favorite books was Winnie the Pooh. Still is. I think I found something appealing in the contrast of that antic sunniness of Pooh and the kind of depressive nature of Eeyore. I was somewhere in between. Pooh's author understood the benefits of that unlikely combination. He wrote, "One of the advantages of being disorderly is that one is constantly making exciting discoveries." It's kind of like my desk. I guess I'm a journalist because I always think there are new and exciting discoveries just around the corner. Discoveries in an age where everyone has an opinion, but so little is new and so much is trite. Discoveries in an age when we are bombarded with so much information and so little news. Discoveries in a time when so much of what passes for inspiration lacks true insight. Discoveries that move us to seize responsibility rather than to grudgingly fulfill obligation. And discoveries at a time when we demand the right to ask questions, which is where you come in. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you. How are we going to do this?
We'll invite them to submit their questions, and
Okay.
hospitality people will pick them up. And this is one from the Sun Prairie Media Group.
Okay, my first question, yay, comes from the Sun Prairie Media Group, as it should be. Grace Richmond wants to know, how do you mentally prepare yourself before going on air? I could say I pray. I've been known to do that, actually. You know what? It's a good question, Grace, because it depends on the situation. Night after night after night becomes, after a while, a routine. You know where you're going to be. You know what you're going to do. Mostly preparing myself comes in making sure that I know what I'm talking about so I don't look like an idiot in front of millions of people on a daily basis. But there are these occasional moments which call for mental preparation. In one of the cases was being a moderator of those two vice presidential debates. I really was conscious that the world was watching. I was also conscious of the fact that both candidates are backstage with timing watches, and they're keeping track of who's getting enough time and who's saying what. And I've got to somehow keep it all going. And someone's in my ear saying, "Okay, that's fine." And only I have all the questions. Nobody else has them. So they've spent all their time trying to figure out what I'm going to ask. I spent all my time trying to make sure they don't figure out what I'm going to ask. It's a little bit of pressure. But once I get out there and the job at hand is in front of me, I focus completely on that, and it's fine. It's those 5 minutes before you get out where you just have to gather yourself together, and it never fills the world with absolute certainty about you if you walk out shaking. So I try to get that out of my system early on. Okay, this is fun. I get to read, which means, okay. I think PBS does a very good job to share and report both sides of the debate. Not so for other networks. What is your opinion of other networks? Oh, you're going to get me in trouble. And do they show more of one side of the issue? Well, this gives me a chance to make my little pitch for PBS, because I worked for NBC News for 5 years before I came to work at PBS, and before that for 4 different newspapers. And the biggest difference between working in public broadcasting and commercial broadcasting is time and resources. We have less resources but more time, which means that if I'm going to tell a story on the evening news, when I worked for NBC, we used to have a segment called In Depth, which was 2 minutes if it was on a really big day. At the NewsHour, a short story is 5 minutes. And so understand that we have, many of the stories you'll see, sometimes you might argue they go on too long, but we do tell the story. And we get as many voices as possible engaged in the discussion so that we're not just throwing at you and then moving off to a commercial, because there are no commercials. And because that means we have a responsibility to be smarter about it, to dig a little deeper, to get the smartest people to answer the questions. I mean, I'm not just sucking up to Frederica, but the reason we put her on the NewsHour is because we know she is the person who's going to take us deepest inside a story, which we have no reason to understand in Washington. And that's what we spend our day. We have a staff that spends their day calling around and trying to find the smartest people in any number of subjects. And every morning I walk to work, I don't know what it might be. It might be something I've never, maybe a coup in Macedonia overnight. I don't know where Macedonia is necessarily. But by 6 o'clock, live on the news, I will be the smartest person you know on the subject, or at least smart enough to find the smartest people to talk about it. So that's, to me, the huge advantage of working for public broadcasting as opposed to commercial broadcasting. Now, I understand that some people don't have the time to invest an hour in non-commercial broadcast every night, and that watching half an hour of the news is the best they can do. But truthfully, this is not the way most people get the news anymore. People younger than folks in this room. I'm just not naming any names. I'm just saying in general, we are more likely to watch the news every night than are our kids. They're going to either see it on their cell phones, you're going to see it on a blog somewhere, and that's the way they're going to get. So you know what? We have a great website as well, the Online NewsHour, where you can not only see all the stories you saw on the air or missed on the air, but also stories that never make it to the air that are just as interesting and take you around the country and take you deeper. So I think that is our way of expanding our reach and becoming even more relevant. Oh, look, lots of questions. I'll keep my answers quicker. Okay. Have you ever interviewed a guest that responded with information that you knew or felt was incorrect, and how did you react? It's the greatest fear of every interviewer, that the person you're saying is going to say something that's blatantly wrong and you don't catch it. They say, I know an interviewer once, Jim Lehrer, who interviewed I don't who said that. Who interviewed Bill Clinton right after the Monica Lewinsky thing happened, and the president, he asked, "Did you have an affair with her?" And the president said, "There is no affair," and he didn't hear the "is." That's where the meaning of "is" comes from. There was an affair, but by answering it in the present tense when the question was posed in the past tense, Bill Clinton knew what he was doing, and every reporter's fear, you don't catch it at the time because it was kind of subtle. And the same thing happens with all of us, where sometimes you catch it and you can stop and say, wait a second, that's not what you said. That's not how it works. And if you're lucky, you can say, I have right here the smoking gun, sir, and that's not what you said. That never happens. So you have to so the hardest part in what we do as interviewers is not just asking the questions, it's listening to the answers. Now, that's just a little bit different from a debate where they simply don't answer you. You ask them about immigration, they start talking about housing. And you can decide that you're going to chase them around the table and say, but, or you can decide that the voters are smart enough to figure out that they evaded the question, and that's usually where I land.
These two are related.
Okay, these two are related. Right, bigger people. How do you choose weekly panelists on Washington Week? And has any thought been given to expanding Washington Week, God bless you, to a 1-hour format? Your lips to God's ear. There's been lots of thought given to it, but write those letters to PBS, my friends. They need to hear it. This is what happens with Washington Week. You know, 3 days of my week I work for the NewsHour, and then Thursday and Friday I work for Washington Week. I have a tiny but mighty staff of 3 on Washington Week that throughout the week sends me stories and links to things that I know. We have about 24 panelists in our stable who we kind of follow what they're writing or what they're reporting on. And then on Wednesday, we come up with a list of just who's been writing what that I can start glancing at. By Thursday, I sit down with my staff and we start to think, how do we make it a program? What are the foremost, I try to think about what are the most important stories we want to tell and then figure out how to tell them. And then once we figure out what the stories are, which is not as easy as you think, then we start going through who's available, because sometimes people are on the road reporting stories, they're out of town, they don't feel like coming out on a Friday night, they got a date, you know, you never know with these reporters. So we try to find out who's available to us, and then it becomes a science experiment, kind of a chemistry experiment. Who is the right group to have around the table? I try never to have just me and 4 guys, for obvious reasons, but I call them my pips when that happens, you know. Because that makes me Gladys Knight, which is nothing wrong with that. But I think it's also important to have as much diversity as you can get around the table, and it shouldn't just end with me. So we get a couple women. We try not to have the same news organization on, more than one, because that seems a little narrow. And then we put in a little dollop of who does Gwen like? And basically, who do I know will give us the best conversation? Because to me, the perfect Washington Week program is when you feel like you're eavesdropping on a really cool dinner conversation, and with people who like and respect each other and are hearing things that maybe they hadn't heard before. That's my idea of a fun show. Oh my goodness. Okay, I'm just gonna wait. Okay. All right. Thank you. I was just gonna do that reaching the ball thing. Will you continue to cover Iraq after the U.S. troops withdraw, especially how many private contractors remain? And what was the media's role or lack of related to going into the war in Iraq? Yeah. They're related in that we'll continue to cover a story that involves American citizens abroad, and certainly Iraq as well. What will happen that once the military president goes away, we'll probably cover it less, but we'll still cover it more than everybody else, so we'll try. The other question about the U.S. decision to go into Iraq, as you know, it's been well documented that there was a lot of how do I put this? We were lied to by the administration about whether there were weapons of mass destruction that required us going in. And many of us were gullible and didn't challenge it sufficiently, and a few actually seemed to champion it. And as a result, there's been a lot of ink spilled regurgitating the media's role in that. I'm not certain we wouldn't have gone in anyway, but I do think that, just as I say, our role is important in a good way, our role can be damaging in a bad way. Okay. There's a difference between opinion and information. Do you think the balance is correct in current journalism? And why do we see reports on who's ahead rather than what they stand for? Could we be better off if provided with more information and less opinion? Yes, yes, and yes. Yes, I do think that the balance is often skewed, but I also think that you have to be careful whether you're watching journalism or opinion. There is opinion journalism, and there's opinion, and then there's journalism. Opinion is fine. They're just yelling at each other. They woke up this morning and decided they thought about this, scratched their head, and went on TV. That's fine. I was going to say scratch something else, but that was rude. And then there's opinion journalism, and that's where you'll see, for instance, Shields and Brooks on the NewsHour on Friday nights, where they have an informed opinion, but they get their opinion based on going and talking to people and actually interviewing them and saying, this is what I think. They clearly have predispositions, but they are courteous to each other. They seldom yell, and they actually seem to like each other. And people respond well to the idea that you can like each other and disagree, and there is that kind of reported opinion. And then there is what I call straight journalism, which is what I do, which is I try to keep as much opinion as possible and try to explain that it's not just to who's ahead and who's behind, even though I'm a defender of the horse race just because it's fun, but also what it means. We were talking at our table about the rise of Herman Cain and Michelle Bachmann and the ups and the downs and the horse race issues. But to me, it's not about who's ahead and who's behind. It's about what it tells us about ourselves. It's not me putting Herman Cain in first place, whether I think Herman Cain would be a great president or not. It's the majority of all these polls, which means somebody out there sees something in him. And what I want to know is what people see, what issues that he's speaking to, which nerve he's striking, and what that tells us about where the country is now. That's the kind of reporting we strive to do. We don't always hit it, but that's what we work for. Okay, fine. We're all good, she says. How do your, I don't know. No, okay, they're all good. How do your, what does that say? Company? I'll compare. How do you compare how the press was used by the founding fathers as how it was used today? Since I wasn't there. I know I've been around for a while, but no, I know what you're saying. I think I know what you're saying, which is, we talk a lot about how the press is used and how terrible it is but the press was far more partisan in its day back then, and it is in a lot of other countries than it is now. This idea that we are, my lovely vaunted notion that we can just be the people who tell you all the ways of looking at things and that you don't have to worry about it is not necessarily the way it's always been done. I am certain that reporters, or whatever they thought of themselves as, were used by the founding fathers to the extent that it helped them get their point of view across as much as we can be used now. I like to think we're a little bit more skilled with it now, but I'm not completely certain. Okay. Should there be, a tax on all citizens to fund public programming rather than relying on pledges? I think England does this. We can barely stay alive with the pledges. So, here's what a truth you need to know about public broadcasting. First of all, nobody's going to say, tax me, so that's not happening. But in addition to that, you should keep in mind that this idea, there's an idea, because the word public is in our title, that we are wholly dependent on the government for our funding, which couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, I would say 1 or 2% of our funding comes from the Corporation of Public Broadcasting, which is seed corn, which we then use to raise the bulk of our information from people like you and from corporations. And that's the way we stay on the air. If you see that long, tiresome line of thank you, thank you, thank you at the end of all of our broadcasts, it's because it takes that and more to keep us on the air. So I really do think, especially since these debates never go away, and periodically we're low-hanging fruit, they come after us, the truth is we're always going to be under assault, even for that tiny portion of our budget that comes from federal monies. But it's important to know, if you're a defender of public broadcasting, that we are far more dependent on people outside the government than on people inside. Okay. I'm sorry, why do I take these off? I don't know why. Given the diversity of today's media, explain the continuing need for publicly funded television and radio. Well, when you say diversity, what do you mean? Because I love to argue with people. I don't know who wrote the question. It's best. You see, I know diversity, I think what you mean by that, giving you the best possible interpretation, is that there are lots of different places to go for your information. I'm not certain that constitutes diversity, and I'm not certain it constitutes depth. In the end, there are a lot of places to go, as I've made this case earlier, to hear lots of things. I'm not certain you can get it in just the way that we deliver it. In my world, I sit down on Friday nights with actual reporters, not pundits, who tell you things they knew from the back of the room, from the back of the elevator, from the back of their notebooks that you may not hear or see anywhere else. And truthfully, we're the only thing like it anymore. And And that to me is really important, because you need someone who's going to tell you why, not that, and someone who's not going to tell you what to believe, but give you information with which you make up your mind. I don't think that exists in this wide diversity of opinion out there, and that's why I think public broadcasting is still important. I was turned on NPR the other day, and I listened to a story that ran for 22 minutes about Native American kidnapping of small children who were given to other families and never got back, and never given back, and how these people had to fight to band together in order to get their own children back. I've never seen that story anywhere else, and certainly nobody would have given it that amount of time and that amount of energy. And that to me is why public broadcasting has to exist. That and Masterpiece Theater. Okay. Why isn't the Occupy movement across the nation being more widely covered? I think it's getting a lot of coverage, actually. In the first few weeks, you could have argued that the Occupy movement was being ignored, but I think now it's really become quite a metaphor for a lot of discontent around the country. And I've traveled half a dozen cities in the last month, and everywhere there's been an Occupy encampment, and every local paper has been covering it. So I would say that it's getting a lot of coverage. The question is, where does that coverage, but more importantly, where does that movement go now? To what extent are the positions held by our legislators dictated by campaign contributors? I don't know. I don't think there's always a provable quid pro quo between money, a check that's written, and an action that's taken. And when that happens, it's helpful to be able to follow the money, as Bob Woodward would say, and try to find it. But I think you ought to also hold out the possibility that people have points of view that they share with people who write them checks. And it's possible that it's the cart leading the horse rather than the other way around. It's not necessarily that if I wish it were so simple. I write you a check, you vote for me, it's not in the public interest. But I guess I choose to believe that far more often it works the other way, which is people agree. And so, like someone said to me, they couldn't believe something a Republican said. I can't remember what it was. And I said, they're Republicans. Of course they believe that. How could they not believe that? They're Republicans. That's their point of view. It doesn't not that they were influenced by someone who wrote them a check under the table, necessarily, even though, we cover that when it happens too. That's always fun. Why doesn't the NewsHour explain facts instead of just letting guests spout opinions that have no truth in what they're saying? Well, I think that's not fair. Here's the NewsHour generally. I'm trying to think of an example from this week. This week, I did a story about the fallout from Arab Spring, and in which it occurred to us that morning there had been elections in Tunisia, and we sat in our morning meeting and we thought we can do a story about the meaning of the elections in Tunisia, but that sounds a little inside. So how can we make this broader? I mean, we had an active discussion among ourselves about how to make this more engaging and more interesting and more relevant. And we do the same thing with the stories out of Greece and the Eurozone. How do you make those stories, which we know are important, but how do you make them matter to people? So instead of just doing a story about the elections in Tunisia, we brought on guests to talk about what had happened to Muammar Gaddafi, who at that point had not been buried after several days, the outcome of the Arab Spring there, the outcome of the Arab Spring in Yemen and in Tunisia. And we brought them around the table and talked about how different and how alike all these uprisings were. Now, the people around the table had opinions, but they were informed opinions, and they were filling in what we had just done, which was, I think, 4 or 5 minutes of a taped report that led into this, explaining the history of what had happened in all of these countries. I think it's those taped reports that lead to the conversation, which give you the facts you need to understand what then is happening in the conversation. So I take issue with it. I think we try to do both. Maybe we don't always succeed, but we try. Has the administration considered reinstating the CCC and the WPA? This would provide lots of jobs. Well, the president's been traveling the country talking about infrastructure rebuilding and how that's going to create jobs. And guess what? Nobody's buying it. That wasn't the CCC and the WPA, but it was certainly a lot of effort to create road building and bridges and identifying bridges that need it, and with the idea that it would then create construction jobs. The truth is, the debate right now has gone far past this basic notion of whether the government can create these jobs, whether the government can fix this. The fundamental disagreement is whether it's the government's role to do this, or whether it's the government's role to take regulations out of the way to allow private government to do that. So, even though this may sound like a great idea if you're on one side of that argument, it sounds like exactly the worst idea if you're on the other side of the argument, because it sounds as if the government is taking over. And there is a majority in the House of Representatives and a lot of people in Washington now who believe that's exactly the wrong direction. So that's where the debate is. You have obviously had to face several hurdles to get it to the point you are today. What perspective can you offer our youth program to respond to? I'm not reading this right, but close. You know, yeah, I suppose we probably all have our hurdles. I mean, I have to say, when I hear that I'm the first African-American woman to have a program, I'm always a little bit surprised by it, because I didn't quite see it that way. I didn't quite think that's what I was trying to do. I was just trying to pursue my passion. And that's the advice that I give young people all the time, which is identify what it is that excites you, that you could imagine getting up every day and doing, and then don't let people tell you no. I'm not kidding. When I talk to these breakthrough candidates, whether it was President Obama or the governor of Massachusetts or the mayor of Iowa City, Iowa, or Buffalo, New York, they're all African Americans who were raised in an environment in which their parents went out and did sit-ins and did whatever it took in order to create public accommodations that their children take advantage of. And then they came through on the benefit of that. Maybe affirmative action helped them, maybe access to places they wouldn't have otherwise been able, even dreamed of going, helped them. And then they thought, and then when they got to the point where they thought, okay, I'll make the big leap, someone told them, no, I don't think you can do that. And that happens. It happens all the time. When I started my very first job in Boston, I was a kid, it was a gopher. I went for this, I went for that. I came to work one day, and at my workspace was a note that said, "Nigger, go home." Now, it will tell you something about me, that my first response to this was, oh, this is terrible. I wonder who it's for. Because my parents had brought us up to think more broadly than that of ourselves. My parents raised us that if someone directed a slur at us, the response was to say, thank you, which always throws the slur, insulter off. They're like, what do you mean? What? They don't know what to do with that. And it leaves you gone, basically. It leaves you with the upper hand. So rather than spending a lot of time worrying about hurdles and worrying about the no's and the people who say it's not, couldn't possibly be your time, the secret is to just keep stepping. And to keep in mind what it is you want to accomplish. Don't let them tell you what it ought to be. And then look back and say, oh, look, I got there. That's the beauty of what I do every day. After 30 years doing this, I am doing what I want to do every single day, including talking to all of you. I feel like I'm on a game show reaching into a bowl. Can you speak to the disconnect between the haves and the have-nots? We have that here, but it seems worse in Washington. I don't know if it's worse, but it's bad. The interesting thing is the Occupy movement has done a very interesting thing. Even though they don't seem all the time to have a very cohesive message, they have managed to get us talking about inequality. Every 6 months to a year, another report has come out, I know, because we cover them all in the NewsHour, if nobody else does, about this widening gap between people who have and people who don't, and how it's not getting smaller, it's getting bigger. No matter how much more prosperous we have, even in times when the country was not in economic stress. But now that we are in economic stress, the haves are losing, and they really feel less generosity toward the have-nots. But nobody wanted to talk about it. Something about the Occupy movement, because the sheer loudness of it has gotten us at least having that conversation. Now, having that conversation doesn't mean we figured out what to do about it. It doesn't mean that we figured out how to shrink the gap. But the first step is to at least acknowledge it. And so we've been running, I don't know if you've been seeing it, but if you haven't, go back to our website and take a look at Paul Solomon's reports on inequality. We have taken about 10 different takes on that subject, including people who say, you know, inequality may be good for the country. We had a guy on last week who said that. There are lots of debates, and there are lots of arguments, but at least we're having it. And I think that that's the first step to trying to be the country that we say we want to be. If journalists are supposed to be unbiased, why do newspapers endorse political candidates? And should they? Why should editorial boards have that kind of influence? Well, I could argue whether they actually do have that kind of influence, but that's a different conversation. There's a distinction between, for me, which I think pretty much holds up between what editorial boards do, what editorial pages do, and what the news sections do. When I worked in newspapers, and we don't endorse candidates in television, so it's not quite the same thing, but when I worked in a newspaper, there was a wall between us and the editorial board. We barely had lunch together. I mean, we'd see each other and avert our eyes. When I worked at the Washington Post, Herb Block, the cartoonist, he used to come out in the newsroom middle of the afternoon with his cartoon, his drawing, and say, "What do you think about that?" And he basically was asking me, is this accurate? He didn't ask me about his opinion. He didn't ask me whether he had reached the right conclusion. He would just say, "Did I get that description of that bill right?" And then he would shuffle off, and the next day would be in the paper. That's the closest I ever came to having any influence over the editorial outcome of a newspaper. And that's the way I like it. So it's what we've always done. I think that most newspapers back when they first started used to be all opinion. They used to be all telling people what they ought to be. Now we built this wall, which I think exists pretty well. But once again, keeping in mind what I said earlier about the different kinds of journalism, the opinion, reported opinion journalism, the opinion, and the straight ahead journalism. Last question. Better be good. Okay, I'll put on my glasses before I even look. How do you stay so unruffled during political debates? Thanks, Mom. It's an excellent question because, in fact, the major goal of the candidates is to ruffle you. I remember asking Sarah Palin a question during the last debate in which her response was, "I don't have a responsibility to answer the moderator's questions." And I had a couple of options here. One was to say, "What?" Which I considered briefly. The other was to let it go. Because I envisioned that the next day the headline, if I were to say "what" to her, would be "cat fight, 2 women fight." Trust me, that's what it would have been. And so I thought to myself, the secret here is to step back from that conversation and to let viewers make their own decision about whether she answered the question or not. I can chase you around the table and say, "Why don't you answer my question?" Or I can hope that if you're an engaged enough person to be watching this debate that you can tell. I saw Rick Perry tried the same thing a couple of weeks ago in one of the debates where he says, "You've come to ask your questions, but I've come to answer mine." I kind of thought that was refreshing. He made it clear he was going to break the rules. I like that. I don't have to be the one to say it. When I moderated my first vice presidential debate, by the way, terror will keep you unruffled. The idea of stumbling and falling focuses the mind, especially in front of that many people. But when I moderated the debate between John Edwards and Dick Cheney, I remember thinking to myself, there was only one vice presidential debate, and it had to be about domestic and foreign policy. And it's a little harder because the premise of those debates is you're the guy who gets the job if the other guy dies. So you don't want to be, too rude about that. But I did want to ask him about something that might not get asked in any of the other debates. And I have to admit, I was conscious of my role as an African-American woman sitting at that table. So I came up with a question. I wanted to ask about AIDS. But I didn't want to ask about AIDS in Africa, which is where all the conversation was focused at that time in 2004. So I asked a question based on numbers I had seen that the rate of HIV infection was soaring among heterosexual African-American women. And I wanted to know what they say about that. Well, the interesting thing that became clear was how they were prepped. John Edwards was clearly prepared, I found out later, to answer a question about, Dick Cheney and John Edwards. Wouldn't I ask them different questions now? I often think about that. Anyway, that was then. Anyhow, he answered the question by saying, my policy on AIDS in Africa is this. He didn't hear what I said. He had come so prepared for a question that I didn't ask that he answered it anyway. Dick Cheney's response was, "Really? I didn't know that." That was it. That was the answer. Now, to this day, in fact, it happened 2 nights ago, someone walked up to me and said, "I really am so glad you asked that question." All this time later, people got what I was trying to do, which was sending the signal that this is not a priority for them. This is not an issue they'd made any investment in, and this isn't something they cared about. And you could make your judgment about whether you think it's important enough based on how they did not answer the question. My other option was to chase them around the table and say, answer my question. But I chose, once again, to step back and let the viewers decide for themselves. And I find that when I trust the people who watch, the people who read, the people who are really engaged in the world around them to pay attention, that I'm never disappointed. So thank you all very much. This has been exhilarating. Thank you.